All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor, first of all, our annual TALMUD TORAH sponsor for Tavshin Pei, the Tillson Family, as a zechus for besuros tovos for all of Am Yisroel. Our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband of 53 years, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Paris, Moshe ben Avraham, David, in commemoration of his fourth yahrzeit, and Avraham and Shaindy Kelman, in memory of their parents, Jerome and Bernice Kelman, and Alexander and Friderica David. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, in merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamos Slav and Eliyahu, the families in Nechama, we hope that in merit Hashem this coming year will truly bring besuros tovos to Klal Yisrael, the return of our hostages, the success of our soldiers, b'chol ma'asei yedehem, and in merit Hashem shalom for all of Klal Yisrael. So those that saying today, being October 7th, there is so much to say and so much to reflect on. I'm gonna leave my comments for them. I'm gonna record them separately, only because we have a limited amount of time today for the daf before slichos. So there's not really enough time to go ahead and focus on anything else. And I will say, but it is important as follows, just to reflect on the following simple idea, which is that a lot of times when anniversaries like this come, we don't know what to do with it. What is the avoda? What is the avoda of today, of October 7th? So of course, it goes without saying that part of the avoda is to mourn. And part of the avoda is to reflect on the losses of Klal Yisrael. And only now, with October 7th and then with the immediate launch into war, so sometimes a person or a nation is so focused on survival that there's not even the opportunity to reflect on what has been lost. In general, you see this even in personal mourning. In personal mourning, that, especially in Yiddishkeit, someone dies who we love, a loved one dies, burial happens so quickly. So I have to get all the arrangements done, then there's Shiva, then I have to throw together eulogy, and everything happens so in such a frenetic pace until finally Shiva's over, and then I have to get back to life. And it's interesting because Chazal created for us the concept of a yahrzeit, and the concept of a yahrzeit is an opportunity to reflect. That's when now a year has gone by, I've gone through an entire cycle of life without my loved one, and I'm able to understand what it is that I have truly lost. And that's the power of an anniversary, that's the power of a yahrzeit, that's the power of reflection. And I think as we come along to October 7th, like I said, I'll share more thoughts later on. But I think as we come to October 7th, we have an opportunity to really take a step back and to reflect. To reflect on the heartbreak, to reflect on the loss, to reflect on the way that our nation, our beautiful ancestral homeland, and we as individuals have experienced such dramatic, monumental change. We are such a different people. We are such a different nation than we were a year ago. And things that we thought we would have to contend with, things we never thought we'd have to contend with, we do. And as we come to this anniversary, it is so important, number one, to focus and to feel the loss and the pain of Am Yisroel. And it's not just those who were killed. There was a moving video that someone sent me, like a chizik video of those who lost limbs in the various texts. If you know what it means to lose a limb. To lose a limb, like, okay, so you're alive. Like, we don't even think about those kind of things. But those are lives that are forever changed. Forever changed, like in dramatic, overwhelming ways. The collateral damage that occurred a year ago is beyond our comprehension. So our part of the avodah is to reflect. The other part of the avodah is to remain confident, hopeful, and secure. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, "Va'ani bechastecha batachti yagel libi b'shuasecha." So literally translated, I trust in your chesed. David HaMelech says, Moshe, I trust that you're going to come through. Yagel libi b'shuasecha. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. And Rabbi Nachman writes so beautifully. David HaMelech was teaching us a profound lesson. It's easy to rejoice in God's salvation when you're currently experiencing it. But that's not the power of the Yid. The power of the Yid is the ability to rejoice in God's salvation in an anticipatory fashion, even before it occurs. Va'ani bechastecha batachti. David says, I am so confident, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you are going to take care of me. I am so confident in your chesed, yagel libi b'shuasecha, that I rejoice in your salvation when? Now. I rejoice now before the salvation even occurred because I'm so confident that it is going to materialize. And it is so incredibly important on this day, as we mourn and as we reflect and as we take stock and as we feel the collective pain of our beautiful nation, to never lose our hope, to never lose our confidence, to feel a sense of joy. I know it sounds strange, but yes, to feel a sense of joy, that most beautiful and holy joy that only comes from optimism, that only comes from belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that stems from the reality. It's not even a belief. It's reality. I know it to be true. I know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to come true. I know the hostages are going to come home. I know our soldiers are going to be successful. I know Mashiach is going to come. And because I'm so absolutely certain of all of those things, Yagel libi bishuasecha, I can rejoice right now. So on one hand, we mourn and we reflect on all that has been lost, but at the same time, we also go ahead and feel a tremendous sense of impending joy, a tremendous sense of incredible confidence, because we know that the Ribono Shel Olam will not only deliver us, will not only save us, but Am Yisroel Hashem will allow us to be successful beyond our wildest imagination. We should be zocheh Am Yisroel Hashem to be able to see the actualization of that aspiration. Meher Rabbi Yameinu. Amen. So we'll see with that. Let us begin. So we're picking up on the bottom of Kuf Gimel on base 103b at the Gemara. Base course stama mai. So let's remember again, going back to the Mishnah for just a moment. So the Mishnah spoke about the idea that there are two different ways in which you could sell land. You could sell base car afar nimocha lecha mida b'chavel. I'm selling you a base car of land. I'm selling you a base car. It's me. It's loud enough. I'm sorry. I'm selling you a base car of land, and I'm going ahead and measuring it with a rope. So the halacha is, once you go ahead and you highlight that you're measuring it with a rope, obviously the intention is both parties are in this for exactly a base car. That is the idea. Conversely, if I go ahead and I sell Ruvain, a base car, I'm selling you a base car, hein chaser, hein yaser. I'm selling you a base car, a little more, a little less. So in that case, then halacha l'maisa, even if there is a little more or a little less, then halacha l'maisa, the transaction still stands. Now, even there, of course, there's a cap to how much more and how much less you could have without it invalidating the transaction. So specifically, the Mishnah pointed out over here that it's 1/4 of a kav per sa'ah. So now the Gemara asks a simple question. So those are our two cases. So base car, I'm selling you as measured by a rope, or base car, hein chaser, hein yes, a little more, a little less. What about Ibailahu, base car stama mai? What happens if Reuven says, I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a base car, and I don't modify the statement, right? There's no modification. So I don't say as measured by a rope, or a little more, a little less, right? I don't say either of those things. I just say I'm selling you a base car. What's the halacha in that situation? So the Gemara says, Tashma. So let's analyze this. Tashma, base car afar nimocha lechamida b'chalas. So close to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a base car of land as measured by a rope, which means, again, specifically a measured base car. Top of Kuf Daled 104a. Pachos kol shehu yinakeh. Yeser kol shehu yachzir. So in that case, halacha l'maaseh, if it turns out that I oversold, so then Reuven is obligated to return it. If I undersold, I'm obligated to give it to Reuven. So I'll say, now what can you infer from this? Hastama kehein chaser hein yaser dami. Now we'll say that what you can infer from that is, it's only in this case where halacha l'maisa, I make an explicit statement that I'm selling you a base car as measured by a rope. That's when I have to sell him exactly a base car. But it sounds like if I just said base car stam, I'm just selling you a base car, that's really the equivalent to base car animocha lecha hein yaser hein chaser. That even means, even if it has a little bit more or a little bit less. Okay, that's the inference. Here's the problem. Amos Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. Ve'im amar lo hein chaser, hein yaser. But yet at the end of the day, look at the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, if I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a car of land, and again, base car, and it might be a little more or it might be a little less, then what's the halacha? Afilu piches rova l'sa'ah, o hosi rova l'sa'ah higio. Then even if it turns out that I undersold or oversold by 1/4 of a kav per sa'ah, ultimately the transaction stands. So what do you see from here? Hastama kemida bechavel dami. So what you see from here is that it's only when you append that statement, hein chaser, hein yeser, that it's an approximate sale. But if you don't append that, then how does the halacha look at it? Like an exact sale. So the Gemara says, see what the problem is. We go through this all the time in the Gemara, where the Gemara essentially ends up with contradictory inferences from two different cases in Mishnah, right? When looking through the lens of the first case, I'm selling you a base car as measured by a rope, that's when it has to be exact. If I would say base car stam, it doesn't have to be exact. But if you infer from the end of the Mishnah, if I sell you a base car, hein chaser, hein yeser, a little more, a little less, That's when there's a little wiggle room. But if you just said base car stam, then it's an exact amount. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Allah meha laka lamashma minei. The truth is, you can't really infer the answer to our question from either of these sources. Okay, so therefore the question still stands. But again, what are the two cases I know? Case number one I know is I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you a base car of land and we're measuring it with a rope. So in that case, everyone knows what does that mean? Exactly a base car. Case number two, I'm selling you a base car, a little more, a little less. And what's the halacha? You could have a little more, a little less. How much little more, how much little less? A quarter of a kav per saw. Fine. What about I just say base car stam? Now, by the way, I'm not saying stam. I'm not saying stam, right? Really what it means is, I'm just saying, I'm selling you a base car. So there's no modifying, modifying appended phrase. So I'm just selling you a base car. So what is that? Which category does that fit in? Okay, so far we haven't been able to answer. Let's go weiter. Tashma. Base car afrani mochelacha. Listen to this brisa. I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you a base car of land. Or ki base car afrani mochelacha. Or I'm selling you like a base car of land. Then what's the halacha? Hein chaser, hein yaser ani mochelacha. Or I say to him, Ruvain, I'm selling you a base car, a little more, a little less. Then what's the halacha? Even if there's a little bit more, i.e. a quarter of a kav per sa'ah, or a little less, a quarter of a kav per sa'ah, ultimately the sale stands. So Rabbi say, what do you see from here? Alma, stama nami kehein chaser, hein yeser dami. So Rabbi said, this brisa seems to be pretty explicit, right? Because the brisa, interestingly enough, we'll have to understand the structure of the brisa, but the brisa essentially says, case number one is I'm selling you a base car, right? Case number two is I'm selling you like a base car, and case number three is I'm selling you a base car, a little more, a little less. The brisa links all three of those cases together and says, in these cases, again, the halacha is that you could sell a little more, a little less, up to a quarter of a kav per sa'ah. So what do you see from here? This seems to be pretty explicit, that base car stam, that when you just sell someone a base car, without any modifying appended phrase, or any appended and modifying phrases, that halacha l'maisa, that is kehin chaser, hein yeser. That means like a little more and a little less. So alma, stama nami kehin chaser, hein yeser dami. So stam base car is like saying, I'm selling you a base car, a little bit more, a little less. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasan perushe kamefarish. The brisa actually is coming along to explain the different phrases of the brisa are there to explain one another. What does this mean? So the Gemara says, watch this. Ezehu base car, shehi ka base car. So Rabbi said, listen to this. What is the case of selling a base car that is like you said, ki base car, right? Because also remember, again, everyone agrees if you say ki base car, I'm selling you like a base car, then what? Then that includes a little more, a little less. So the Gemara is asking, so the way the Gemara reads the brisa is almost like a question and answer. What is the case of selling a base car that is like selling like a base car? What's that case? Kegon da amarle hein chaser hein yeser. It's equivalent. It's the case where again I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a base car, a little more, a little less. A little less. Interestingly enough, fascinating. We thought originally in the brisa, we thought the brisa was three cases. We thought the case number one was base car, case number two was ki base car, and case number three was base car hein yeser hein chaser hein yeser. Kamash the Gemara says it's actually one case. It's actually one case. What's the case of where you sell someone a field and you could sell a little bit more, a little bit less than a base car? That's the case of the Amarle in Chaser and Yeser. Okay, so Maskav Rav says 1 second. If that's the case, in Cain, here's the problem with interpreting the brisa that way. What's the problem? Is it doesn't read well. Right? If you look at the lashon of the brisa, right? How does the brisa reads as three independent cases? Because how is it structured? Base car afar ani mochelacha, right? Base car afar ani mochelacha. Ki base car afar ani mochelacha. Hein chaser hein yeser ani mochelacha. The phrase ani mochelacha, I'm selling to you, is included by each case. What would that indicate? That would indicate that there are three distinct cases and not one modifying case. To which the Gemara maskar Rashi imkain ani mochelacha lamali elalav shmamina stoma nami kehin chaser hin yeser dami shmamina. Therefore, both say, interestingly enough, the Gemara reverts back to its original reading of the brisa, and actually the way to read the brisa is actually as three distinct cases. So really, halacha, what the Gemara is saying is like this. The case of base car stam, where I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you a base car. No appended modifying phrase. Or I say to Ruvain, I'm selling you like a base car. Or case number 3, I'm selling you a base car. Hein chaser, hein yaser. A little more, a little less. In all of those cases, what is the halacha? The halacha is, it's not an exact sale, and up to a quarter of a kaf per saw is an acceptable margin of error. So you see from here that base car stam is like chaser and yaser. That when you just sell someone selling you a base car, it's understood that there's an acceptable margin of error within the measurement of that field. So therefore, it turns out, just if we pause here for just a second, so we have halacha lamaisa, 3 cases, right? Case 1 is I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a field, mida b'chava, and we're measuring it exactly. In that case, no margin of error. If it turns out that I sold more than a base car, less than a base car, then that has to be settled up. Case number 2, I'm selling you a base car, hein chaser, hein yeser. I say that. A little more, a little less. Then ultimately I get a margin of error. What is that margin of error? A quarter of a kav per saw. Third case, I'm selling you a base car. And that's it. Just the statement, I'm selling you a base car. What's the halacha in that scenario? The halacha in that scenario ultimately is that is treated like hein chaser, hein yeser. That is treated ultimately, again, as if there's an acceptable, margin of error. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, so that is our first nugget of halacha l'maisa today. 3 cases. Next. Mal machzor lamo. So we'll see within the Mishnah, if you remember again, explained that in these cases where there is let's say again, the seller oversold, and therefore the buyer owes him some land in return. So the Mishnah espoused a very interesting idea that the seller has the right to either ask for land or for money. He could choose whatever he wants, right? Because remember again, what's going on over here? If I'm the seller, let's say it turns out that I sold Ruvain a base car, and let's say it turns out that I sold him too much land, so now he owes me back land. So here's the problem. If I sold him, if the amount of land that he has to give back to me is relatively, minuscule piece, it's worthless to me. What am I going to do with it? So I don't want a small piece of land. Instead, what I want is cash. So the Mishnah highlights that the halacha sides with the seller and gives the advantage to the seller. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. So the Gemara makes it sound like, the Gemara asks, the Mishnah makes it sound like we only care about bolstering the rights of the seller, but not bolstering the rights of the purchaser. But is that true? Vatanya, we learned, Piches Shivas Kabin Umechza Lakar. So let's say again, I sold to Ruvain and land-based car, and it turns out that I undersold it, literally again, 7.5 kabin per car. Now the Rashbam points out over here, almost right across, if you move your finger to the right and about 6 lines down, it says, Shivas kabin umechza lakar, hainu nami roba l'sa'aki l'tanim masnisin. This is actually the same shear of a quarter kav per sa'ah. Okay, so it turns out that I went ahead and I undersold, right? I told Reuben I was giving him a core of land, and it turns out that I gave him too little. So I owe him. Oh, hosir shivas kavenu mechsa lekar. Or for that matter, again, I sold him too much land. So what's talacha? Higiu. So remember again, this is within the acceptable margin of error. This obviously is presupposing that we're talking about a case of either base core stam or base car chaser v'yaser. So the Gemara says, fine. Oh, what happens if I oversold it, right, or undersold it by higher than the acceptable margin of error? So that's halacha. Kofen es hamocher limkar ve'es halokeach likach. We force the seller to sell it, right, or the purchaser to purchase it. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. So the Rashbam, almost right across. If you just move your finger to the right and about 5 lines down. We force the seller to sell the additional amount of land to the purchaser. In other words, so now In this case over here, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, right? We force the purchaser to sell the land to the seller. No, we force the seller to sell the land to the purchaser. So if the seller wants the land, in other words, if the seller says, I don't want the money, I want the land. The same way that we could force the seller, the same way that we could force the purchaser to keep the land and return money for the benefit of the seller, right? So shelo yehi nifsad hahu miyot karka the kolfan midas dom. Because also remember again, like we said before, in a case where halacha l'maisa, the seller oversold. So now the purchaser owes land back to the seller. So the seller says, I don't want that land. I don't want that land because that minuscule piece of land is irrelevant and unusable for me. So we'll force the purchaser to pay money and not give back and not give back land. And interestingly enough, the Rashbam says the reason we do this, he's fasting, he throws this in kolfin al midas stone. Right? Midas stone. So we'll say, so what's midas stone? So midas stone was, the halacha understands if I want to do something that's advantageous to me. But sometimes in life something is irrelevant to me, but it's advantageous to someone else. So midas slom is when you won't do something advantageous for someone else, even though what? It has zero impact on you. So the Gemara understands over here. So for example, in this case where I sold Reuven a base car, and let's say I sold him too much land, more than the acceptable margin of error. So now the halacha says, so I say, I don't want land back. I want money. Now, for Reuven, what does it matter if he gives back money? He gives back land, right? It's the same. It's the same thing. So the halacha is we force Reuven to give back money and not land. So look at the Rashbam. He goes on. He says, "Hachanami avud rabbanan takanta lelokeach shukofnes hamocher limkar lo hahu miut karka kadesh lo yidros eitzos adeu." So we'll say, so the reverse case. The reverse case is as well. That let's say halacha l'maisa, we would force the seller to give land to the purchaser, right? In a situation where, let's say again, it was undersold, right? He didn't deliver enough. So let's say the seller says, I'll give you money. I'll give you back some money. And the purchaser says, no, I want the land. Why? Because the purchaser doesn't want the seller having a strip of land right by his land. So we'll force the seller to give the purchaser the land. What's the point? From the Mishnah, it sounds like that the halacha is only concerned with the rights of the seller, not the rights of the buyer. Kamash on the Brisa says that we are concerned with both of their rights. Finish up that Rashbam. That Rashbam says over here, Hachanami avoid Rabbanan takanta lelokeach. Last of the short lines. Therefore, the Rabbanan also made a takana by the purchaser. Shiu kofin es hamocher limkar lo ahu miyot karka. That again, in a situation where, let's say now the seller owes something to the buyer. So the seller might say, I want to give you cash. But Allah Chamaisa, the buyer can say, no, I don't want the cash. I bought a base car of land. I want the rest of the land. Why? I don't want you, seller. I don't want you anywhere near my land. Kadesh lo yidros eitzos adeu veitzarach lihishamer mimenu va'mocher eno nizak bekach dahalo chazi lemid yahu parta favile zenene v'zeino chaser. So I will say, so in this case over here, where essentially I sold Reuven the land, I told him I was selling him a base car, but I delivered less than a base car. So now I say, okay, I'll give you money. I'll refund some of your purchase price. So Reuven has the right to say, no, give me the rest of the land, because if you don't give me the land, that means you're going to retain ownership over that strip of land. I don't want you on that strip of land right next to my land. Now, for the sellers, from my perspective, it doesn't really make a difference, because that strip of land, I can't do anything with it anyway. So from my perspective, whether I give him money, whether I give him land, it doesn't matter. So it's called zenene v'zeino chaser. Reuven benefits. It's not a detriment to me, and therefore we force it. What's the point? The point is, you see that halacha looks out not only for the rights of the seller, but the rights of the purchaser as well. Back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, "Vatanya piche sheva kabel mechzel kara hosir yad hasam kigon." So listen to this. Gemara says, "I'll tell you, it's a different case. Hasam kigon dav yakira meikara v'zil hashta." We're talking about a case that at the time of the sale, the land was expensive, and now it went down in value. The Amrino lay that we say ultimately to him, if I'm going to go ahead and, they say, the halacha says to me, the seller, that if I'm going to go ahead and make the purchaser whole, I have the ability to give him land in accordance with the depreciated current value. Wow. So in other words, halacha l'maisa again, yes, I have the ability, in other words, the purchaser has the right to go ahead and demand land over money. but the halacha still looks out for the rights of the seller more, because in the event of a change in value, halacha l'maisa, I, the seller, can make the buyer whole at the depreciated value of real estate. But we learned, Kishu no sin lo kishash lo kach mimenu. But we learned that halacha l'maisa, if I'm giving extra land in order to, not extra, right? I'm giving the additional land in order to make the purchaser whole, that I give him in accordance with the value of the land as at kishash lo kach mimenu, at the time that I bought it, at the time of the transaction. Hasan kigon dahavazula meikara vikara lahashta. That's talking about a case, interestingly enough, where it was inexpensive then, and then went up in value. So if it went up in value, I have the ability to give him the land in accordance with the value of the land at the time of the transaction. So we'll say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, the ruling of the Mishnah is correct, meaning that the halacha looks out for the rights of the seller more than the rights of the buyer. So fascinating, so we protect it. And therefore, again, in this case over here, just to kind of circle it back, in this case where it turns out that there was an oversell or an undersell, assuming that we are above the threshold of acceptability, halacha l'maisa, it is the seller who has the right to decide, am I giving cash or am I giving land? Same thing with return, it's the seller who could go ahead and dictate, am I getting cash or am I getting land? So we'll say, what will be the logic? What will be the logic of protecting the seller? Right, so we'll say. So again, it's this is capitalism, right? We want people to sell property. We want people to engage in transactions, especially property sales. Which again, it seems from the Gemara's perspective that halacha l'maisa. When did you sell property? When you were in trouble, right? People really did not sell real estate unless they really had to. So it seems like this was to encourage some type of real estate market by protecting the rights of the seller. Okay, interesting. Let's go weiter. Shimshir besad the base test cabin. So let's just remember again that interestingly enough, this concept that the seller has the right to go ahead and either demand money or land, whatever benefits him most, only is in a case where the land in question is very insignificant. Because what is the seller going to do with that insignificant strip of land? But the Mishnah then goes on to say that if the piece of land is significant, then halacha l'maisa, we deal in land and not in money. So the Mishnah gave examples of significant amounts of land, right? Beis tisha kabin, there was, I'm just quoting to you from Mishnah, shimshir besada. So for example, again in the field, it would be an area of 9 kabin. In a gino, an area of a half a kav, and according to Rabbi Akiva, besuros. Right, so these are already more significant amounts, and if the transaction dealt with these amounts of land, then you would deal with returning land and not money. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, tes kabin she'amar afilu bebeka gidola. So Rav Huna comes along and says, by the way, the tes kabin that we're talking about over here, the 9 kav of land, is even in a very large field. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's about 7 lines up from the bottom. Amar Rav Huna, tes kabin she'amru b'masnisin din chosiru b'sada lesnu b'toras mechira v'lo b'toras asiyas cheshbon li'afos kochu l'okech el lechazaras karka. Now the Mishnah spoke about that if you're dealing with tes kabin of land, in other words, if that was the margin of error, that you go ahead and you return the land and not money, that's even if it's tes kabin in a very large field, right? Because everything is relative. Tes kabin is significant, but I might have thought that tes kabin in a very large field is not so significant. Kamash Malan it is. I feel big gidol. Rav Nachman says, no saying shivas kabin umekta l'chol kor v'kor. So Rav Nachman says essentially that halacha l'maisa, there essentially is a forgivable amount of 7.5 kavin for every lechol kar v'kar, for every car. Amud beis v'ika milsa yisera l'tishas kavin handri. So obviously I will say, if it turns out that the transaction erred, transaction is the wrong English, but if it turns out that the parties erred in the transaction more than that amount, so therefore again the amount of error, the amount of real estate error gets up to the amount of 9 kabin, then of course I will say once we get to that threshold, then everything is returned, or the additional land is returned. Eisvei Rav Nachman. So Rav asked Rav Nachman the following shaila: Shimshir b'sada beis tisha kabin Eisvei Rav Nachman. So Rav came out to Rav. So let's remember again. So Rav Nachman was of the opinion that halacha l'maisa 7.5 kavin, right? 7.5 kavin is the forgivable amount. Up to that amount is a forgivable. If you look at the Rashbam, last Rashbam and Amud Aleph, Deloshna rova echad l'sa'a echad veloshna elef revayim la'elef sin have mechila. That the forgivable amount in a transaction ultimately is 7.5 kavin for every core. And it doesn't matter how large the field is, that's the ratio. More than that, if it gets to a ratio of 9, that's when halacha l'maaseh we're going to have to return it. Okay, so now comes the second line, Kuf Dalet Amud Beis 104b. Here we go. Eisei Rav Nachman. So Rava raised the kasha to Rav Nachman. So Shimshir B'Sada Beis Tisha Kavin. So the Gemara says, if you went ahead and there was left over in the field of 9 kavin, lav dezavan lekurayim. Are we not talking about a situation where halacha l'maaseh there's only 2 core of land that was sold, in which case the ratios are off? Lo dezavan lekor. Now we're talking about a situation where halacha l'maaseh he only sold them a core. Ubegina beis chatzi kav, and in a gina even a half a kav. Lav dezavan lesasayim. Are we not talking about a case where the gina in question was 2 saw, in which case again Rav Nachman's math doesn't work? Lo dezavan lesah. Now we're talking about a case ultimately of 1 saw. Ukedir Rabbi Akiva besuros. And according to Rabbi Akiva besuros, my lab dezavan lesah. Are we not talking about where the property, right, the transaction was only 1 saw? Lo dezavan lechatzi saw. So we'll say, so again, this was just a series of questions lobbed at each of these opinions to contradict the position of Rav Nachman, but it turned out the Gemara answers it by essentially saying that each of them were dealing with a sale of a certain shear. Okay, fine. But Rashi, we'll say now, listen to this case. So, now we'll say, now here's one of the interesting things that comes out from the Mishnah. Depending on what it is that you're selling, so the margin of error differs, right? Which makes sense. In other words, if you take a look, like even in the Mishnah, right? So the Mishnah we had a sada. Sada usually means like a wheat field, a gina, which is a garden, which could be vegetables, right? So you have different fields that have different forgiveness amounts, or different margins of error. To which the Gemara asks an interesting question. By Rav Ashi, sada v'nas is gina v'nas is sada mai. What happens if you have a tract of land that originally was a sada, then was converted to a gina, or a gina, then converted to a sada? So what's the halacha? What do you do about the status of a transaction for that field? In other words, how are you gauging the margin of error? According to what it originally was, or according to what it is? To which the Gemara answers, teku. Okay, we have to leave that. Interesting. So the Gemara says as follows: Tana em hayasamoch l'sadehu. I'm sorry. Tana hayasamoch l'sadehu afilu kol shu machzir lo karka. So this is a very interesting case. If you look at the Rashbam, so it's about I think about 20 lines up from the bottom. Tana im haya. Look at the Rashbam inside. So Tana im haya hahu sadeh shemachar samoch l'sadehu acher. Afilu im hoser kol shu al zayin kavinu mechza lekor machzir lo karka v'lo yaseh cheshbon da chazi litztarufe l'sadehu. So we'll say, now listen to this. I sold Reuven a field. And what happened? And halacha l'maisa, it turns out that I oversold. But I oversold less than the shear. So what's the halacha? The halacha is so I sold Reuven a field that was next to one. So in other words, I own a field, call it field A. I sold Reuven field B, which is right next to my field A. And what happens? Afilu im hoster kol shu al zayin kabenu mechza lekor machzir lo karka diolo yaseh cheshbon. Even if halacha l'maisa, it turns out that, let's say, undersold, oversold by a negligible amount. So normally we would return money. In this case, you automatically return land. Now, what's the logic behind that? Because since the land that I'm selling is right next to land that I already own, so the strip of land is meaningful, right? It expands the borders of my current field. So interesting, what the Gemara is saying is like this, whereas normally the seller has the right, in a case, let's say, where he oversold, to say either give me back money or give me back land. If the field that I sold is right next to a field that I currently own, the halacha says, purchaser, give back land. Give back land. Finish up the Rashba. Because that extra strip of land is meaningful because it could be combined with the field that I already own. So we'll say, interestingly enough, this is one of these situations where really no one loses and everyone benefits. In other words, the purchaser, he's going to have to return something anyway. So it does, and either way, the seller, meaning me, I'm going to be Reuven's neighbor regardless. So in this case, because there's an objective benefit to me getting back that little strip of land, the halacha says return it. Fascinating. So the Gemara asks the following question. Back to the Gemara. Boy Ravashi, bar mausha tafsik, amas halai mausha tafsik. So let's see, now what happens about the following? Let's say there is that strip of land, but let's say again, look at the Rashbam, bar mausha tafsik, beinahu moser l'sada. So let's say again, I own field A, and now I sold Reuven field B. It turns out that I oversold, and therefore he owes me land back. So again, the halacha is he has to give me back a strip of land because that little strip of land, which would normally be insignificant, is significant now. Why? Because it abuts a field that I already own. What happens if there's a bar between the extra strip and my field? So there's my field A, my bar, a bar, right, and then that other strip. Do we still say that Reuven has to give me back that strip or not? Or for that matter again, there's a stream between the extra strip and my field. Or the Gemara says, Derech Harabim, there's a public pathway between that strip and my field. Or Richba de Dikla, Ma'ashat Tafsik, or there's a row of palm trees. Does that interrupt? So both say, the idea that when the Gemara says that when I oversold and Reuven has to give me back the strip of land, that presupposes, what are we talking about? That there's a contiguity that exists. Now the shaila is, if the contiguity is disrupted by a row of palm trees, a stream, do we still say that Reuven gives me back the land automatically? Or maybe he gives me money. Okay, so that's a teiku. Last part of the Gemara. So ultimately, again, he doesn't. So remember, the Mishnah said, once the transaction goes above the acceptable additional threshold, then ultimately, again, not only do you return the quarter kavs, right? Because remember, again, the acceptable amount is a quarter kav per sa'ah. So once it goes over the acceptable threshold, not only do you return the quarter kav, so you give back all the extra. To which the Gemara says, I don't say that doesn't make any sense. It should be just the opposite. Klap elaya. So it should be phrased the opposite way. You give back the extra, and once you're giving back the extra, you have to give back all the forgiven amounts. What does this mean? It's actually quite interesting. The Mishnah said that if I sell Reuven a base car, hein chaser, hein yes, a little more, a little less, then what's the halacha? Even if I sell them up to a quarter kav per sa'ah, more or less, the transaction stands. Above that, I have to return. What the Mishnah is saying is, once you have to return not only the extra, but all of the quarter kav of sa'ahs, per core as well. So the Gemara says, you're right, I just have to read it. 20 Rabban Rav Nachman, Lo Asamos Rav Bilba Machzir, you don't only return the additional amounts, but rather Ella Kol HaRiva'in, Ella Es Kol HaRiva'in Kula. So we'll say, so once you go above the acceptable threshold, not only do you have to go ahead and return the excess, but at that point you also have to return all of the additional quarter kav per sa'ah amounts as well. All right, we'll say, Shkoyach. I'll tell you one thing, the Ribono Shalom has really given us a tremendous kiss that in these days of slichos, they are short, long rashbams, but shorter dapim, Baruch Hashem. Right? It's a shkoyach.